Good morning and welcome. We'll just wait a few minutes while everyone arrives. Good morning if you've just joined us. We're about to start the session on due diligence, but we'll just give everyone a few more moments to arrive. Good morning and welcome if you're just joining us. This is the due diligence session. We'll just give everyone a moment or two to arrive. Good morning, everyone. It looks like we're almost about halfway there, so we'll just wait another moment or two to allow people to get settled, and then we'll get started. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the second of our 5 in-depth seminars on the changes to our credit laws. Many of you will have attended our high-level seminar a couple of weeks ago. However, we know simply from the large number of attendees here today that many of you didn't. So if you missed it and want to see a high-level summary of the 5 main areas that are changing, which are responsible lending, due diligence, directors' duties, fees and advertising, and certification, as well as hearing from Commission leaders discussing the education and enforcement approach the Commission has taken, then you can find a recording of that session on our website, and the link's in the chat now. We also made a series of informative handouts detailing the main changes that are underway. If you haven't received these, you can email us, or they're available on our website. And again, the link will pop up in the chat function. So for those of you who did attend the high-level seminar a few weeks ago, I'd like to thank you for filling in the surveys at the end. Your questions were thoughtful and relevant and really helped us make sure that these in-depth sessions deliver information that you want to hear about. So we've used your queries to structure today's discussion, and we hope that's useful for you. So as you know, today's seminar focuses on due diligence, and our expert, Alex Smail, will be addressing some of your key questions and available for a more informal Q&A chat session at the end. But first, before we start, I'll open with karakia. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te taonga, kia mā kena kena ki uta, kia mā tara tara ki tai. E hiaki ana te atakura, he tio, he hoka, he hauhonga, tihei mauri ora. So before inviting Alex to speak with you all, I'll quickly go over some housekeeping. If you have a technical issue, please raise your virtual hand. It's under the reactions button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll see if we can assist in the chat function. You can also use the chat function to ask any questions that arise for you during our discussion today. We received many dozens of questions from you after the high-level overview seminar a few weeks ago, and you'll see those coming through today. Now, Penny Fitzpatrick is handling our Zoom, and I'd like to introduce her now. Welcome, Penny. And thanks so much for helping us out.
Kia ora koutou. It's a pleasure, Sonia. I'll be handling the chat function today and putting through any of your questions to Alex. You can pop these in the chat function or note them down in the survey that will pop up at the end of this webinar when you close the window. Kia ora.
Thanks, Penny. So now, please welcome today's expert, Alex Smail. He's a legal counsel with the Commerce Commission, and he's one of the key experts who prepared the Commission's guidance, as well as training staff, so that when come December 1, our staff have a good understanding of what's required by the duty, and which hopefully you'll also have by the end of this session. Welcome, Alex.
Kia ora, Sonia, and kia ora tātou. Ko matarangi te maunga, no te whanganui a tara ahau. Ko Smail toku whānau, ko Alex toku ingoa. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
So, recapping what we've previously discussed, the due diligence duty focuses on new personal obligations of the senior managers and directors of lenders and mobile traders. Its purpose is to improve compliance with the Credit Contracts and Consumer Finance Act by incentivizing directors and senior managers to ensure that adequate compliance systems are in place. The law change creates a duty to exercise the care, diligence, and skill that a reasonable director or senior manager, as the case may be, would exercise to ensure that the business complies with its duties and obligations under the CCCF Act. This means that compliance with the duty is assessed objectively. The care, diligence, and skill required from each individual subject to the duty will depend on a number of things, including the size of the business and the nature of the credit the lender provides, as well as the nature of the individual's responsibilities and the level of influence that person has in the parts of the business governed by the law. Today, we're going to spend a bit of time venturing into some more specific ways that you can meet the duty, and hopefully, with the aid of examples, you'll develop a greater appreciation of what the duty requires of you as a director or senior manager. We will not be revisiting the matters that my colleague Wendy covered in the last seminars, including who are directors and senior managers, what due diligence means, and what the penalties are for breaching the duty. However, if you do have questions about those topics, or a topic I covered today, we encourage you to ask questions using the chat function, and we will endeavour to answer these questions either today or at a later date.
That's great, Alex, thanks. So I think, we all know that due diligence means exercising the care, diligence, and skill that a reasonable director or senior manager in the same circumstances would exercise. And this is to make sure that the business complies with its duties and obligations under the CCCFA, the Credit Contracts and Consumer Finance Act. But what does it actually require?
So due diligence requires you to take reasonable steps to ensure that the ways in which the lender undertakes its lending tasks, in other words, its procedures, are designed to ensure compliance with the CCCF Act and its regulations. The duty also requires adequate supervision to ensure that the lender's procedures are properly implemented and maintained to ensure compliance. Now, this means, but is not limited to, taking reasonable steps to ensure that the lender establishes and maintains procedures which may or may not be automated that are designed to result in compliance with the CCCF Act and regulations, that it requires its staff, whether those staff are employees or agents, to follow those procedures, that it undertakes reasonable checks on whether the procedures are A, doing what they're designed to do, for example, by sampling or testing, and B, are being used correctly, whether or not they are manual or automated. That it employs reasonable methods to identify any deficiencies with its systems, and that it promptly remedies any deficiencies that it finds. I will just reiterate here that you will not necessarily breach your due diligence duty just because the lender breaches the CCCF Act. The emphasis of these obligations is on helping to ensure that lenders develop compliant procedures, take reasonable steps to implement them, monitor compliance effectiveness, and fix errors where they occur. I also reiterate our recommendation that you keep records about the steps you personally have taken to meet your due diligence duty.
That's great. Alex, a lot of the stuff that you're talking about is quite detailed. What we might do is put a couple of summaries in the chats, and that helps people stay on track. So when you talk about establishing systems and procedures, what does that actually mean for a director or a senior manager?
So performing the duty requires you to take reasonable steps to ensure that the lender has a procedure or a series of procedures in place for lending tasks to ensure compliance with the CCCF Act and regulations. They can be automated or can rely on employees or agents to follow them. But in either case, directors and senior managers are expected to ensure that each system or procedure is designed to meet the lender's obligations. Now, that might be through quality assurance and making sure the procedures are appropriately tested, for example. They are expected to make sure that there is a manager or managers responsible for the development and implementation of the system and who will report on the implementation and performance of those systems to directors and senior managers. They are expected to ensure that there is sufficient resource made available to develop and implement the systems and procedures, and they are expected to understand the compliance risks associated with those systems and procedures. Now, to help with illustrating my point, I will use responsible lending as an example, and in particular, the affordability and suitability assessments required by the lender responsibility principles and the incoming regulations. I will just stress, though, that the due diligence duty does not apply solely in respect of those obligations, but in respect of all of the lender's obligations under the CCCF Act. So it also relates to areas like disclosure, hardship, cancellation, and the rules around the charging of interest and fees, to name a few. So, looking at the establishment and implementation of systems and taking affordability and suitability as an example, once you have taken the time to understand the lender's obligations under Section 9C of the CCCF Act, which my colleague Mark talked about in this morning's session, you should ensure that the lender has a procedure or procedures in place so that staff know what inquiries they should make and what information they should receive from the customer, when they should verify information and what sort of verification they should get, how they should assess affordability and suitability, and what records they should keep. If any part of the lender's affordability checks, for example, are automated, you should ensure that the lender tests the automated system for compliance with the CCCF Act and regulations.
And Alex, you said staff need to follow these systems and procedures. What do you have to do to make sure that that happens?
Yes, that's right. So you'll need to take reasonable steps to ensure that the lender has procedures in place to clearly and appropriately communicate the systems and procedures within the organisation. So this may involve ensuring staff and agents are regularly trained in how to use them, having the procedures accessible in written form where appropriate, and encouraging and incentivizing staff to follow them. For example, in job descriptions and through the use of key performance indicators, KPIs, linked to the use of those procedures. So returning to that responsible lending example I was using before, there are a variety of ways you can make sure the lender's staff use the procedures. For example, you can require staff to confirm that they have followed each procedure before each loan application is processed. And for parts of the process that are automated, you can ensure that the loan application cannot be progressed without all of the relevant information being provided. You should take steps to ensure that the lender requires staff to keep records of the inquiries they make and how they assess affordability and suitability. You should also ensure that the lender has sufficient record-keeping procedures in place where the system is automated. We also encourage you to take reasonable steps to ensure that any sales incentives provided by the lender are structured in such a way so as to ensure that staff are encouraged rather than discouraged to use the procedure.
That all makes good sense. So then once your systems are set up and the staff know how to use it, is that job done?
No, it's certainly not, Sonia. It's certainly not a case of set and forget. So you should be taking reasonable steps to ensure that the lender is undertaking regular checks of the procedures and that the results of those checks, including any remedial steps required, are being reported to and considered by you. So using that responsible lending example again, we would suggest you take reasonable steps to ensure that there are reporting mechanisms for staff that are undertaking suitability and affordability assessments to raise issues with the systems, and that the lender requires procedures to be documented or confirmed by staff when used. You should also ensure the lender is having its loan application records regularly audited to ensure that staff are properly following the lender's procedures regarding affordability and suitability. You should require reports to be provided to you on the results of those audits. If you are using an audit process and the results are not satisfactory, meeting your due diligence duty may also mean requiring the lender to implement changes to the systems or further staff training. Because due diligence is an ongoing obligation, you should be taking reasonable steps to ensure the lender is identifying any deficiencies that exist in its compliance systems. Now, this might be achieved through setting policy and compliance targets at a high level and ensuring the lender has a methodical way of monitoring the implementation and use of the systems. You should ensure that the lender regularly reviews complaints, defaults, and hardship data to help to ascertain whether the procedure has been followed and whether it is sufficient to ensure compliance with the lender responsibility principles and regulations.
That's great, Alex. So I think, one of the things that people will be thinking about will be, what other things directors and senior managers should be doing. And as they're thinking about that, if people have questions that come up, feel free to pop them into the chat. We've got people as well as Penny in the background, seeing if we're able to answer them, and then we can ask Alex these questions at the end. So one of the things that came up out of the high level session that we ran a few weeks ago asked, what should directors and senior managers be doing where the lender spots an issue with its systems and procedures?
Sure. So the duty also requires directors and senior managers to take prompt action where the lender has identified failures with its systems and procedures. Now, the steps we suggest taking include requiring management to address and remediate the issue and to report back to you on that, ensuring that the lender stops using the deficient system in the meantime, or if that's not possible, identifying impacted borrowers and adopting procedures that mitigate harm, and ensure that the lender has a procedure in place to remediate the borrowers affected by the problem to date. For example, by making corrective disclosure if it's a disclosure issue, refunding overpayments if it's a cost of borrowing issue, and compensating those customers where it's anticipated by the scheme in the Act. So using our responsible lending example, where you become aware that a procedure has not been followed or is not sufficient to comply with the lender responsibility principles, you should ensure that the lender undertakes a root cause investigation and that you receive the results of that report. You should also ensure that there is a procedure in place that requires the lender to stop using the deficient procedure until it has been fixed, or that identifies impacted borrowers. For example, borrowers that might receive loans that should otherwise be assessed as unaffordable, and that it adopts procedures that minimize and mitigate harm arising from the problem. For example, if there is an issue with an automated process, perhaps a senior staff member should step in to oversee an equivalent manual process until the automated system is fixed. You should also require regular reporting of steps that have been taken. Now, you should ensure that the lender has a procedure to identify solutions that might fix the deficiency and that those solutions are tested and implemented. You should also ensure that a process is in place to identify and mitigate risks arising from a failure to comply with the lender responsibility principles. For example, if a borrower can be identified as having received a loan that, but for the issue, would have been assessed as unaffordable, the lender should have a process in place to work with that borrower to ensure the terms of the agreement can be amended to ensure the borrower is not likely to go into substantial hardship by making repayments. I should pause here to reiterate that I've used the example here of responsible lending, and in particular, the affordability and suitability requirements imposed by the lender responsibility principles. However, the due diligence duty does not apply solely in respect of those obligations, but in respect of all of the lender's obligations under the CCCF Act.
It's great to have that example, and I'm sure everyone understands that what you're talking about is an example in one part of it. They do apply across all of the lender obligations. So Alex, is there anywhere else that our participants can go to for more guidance or examples on how to meet the due diligence duty?
Yes, Sonia. So I would encourage anyone who would like more guidance or examples to go to the Commission's guidance on due diligence, which is available on the Commission's website.
That's fantastic. Hey, so I can see some really good questions coming through. And I just want to remind everyone, so you can pop your questions in the chat, but there's also an opportunity to ask more questions via our survey at the end of this session. It's also good to remember that the handouts have really good details to refer to, and you can email us if you haven't got them as well. They're also on our website. So Alex, one of the questions we got through asks, what are the different expectations on directors as against senior managers? Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So as a first point, I'd say that the responsibilities of directors and senior managers and the people occupying those roles will overlap to some extent and to varying degrees in different organisations. So in larger organisations, you'd expect the directors and senior managers to be the board and the top level executives, i.e. the chief executive and all of the people who report to the chief executive. But in smaller organisations, there might be sort of more overlap between the roles of directors and senior managers, as well as the roles of senior managers and more operational positions. So that's just something to be mindful of. But where the organisation does maintain a distinction, we would expect that directors are more likely to fulfil their duty or meet their duty by directing and requiring management to undertake tasks aimed at achieving compliance, setting the approach to a resource allocation and prioritization within the organisation, and overall just driving a culture of compliance. Whereas senior managers are more likely to satisfy their duty by implementing, by being involved in the implementation and performance of compliance measures in areas where they have responsibility or influence.
That makes sense. It's that delineation between leadership and the operational side of the business.
That's right.
Hey, so there's a question about mobile traders that I think is probably useful. We had a few questions come in about mobile traders with our previous session around responsible lending as well. So this question asks, when are the directors and senior managers of mobile traders subject to the due diligence duty?
So directors and senior managers of mobile traders are subject to the duty where they enter into credit sales, and that's simply because those contracts are treated as consumer credit contracts under and for the purposes of the CCCF Act. So the definition of mobile trader for the purposes of the Act is found in Section 5, and that's basically the determining factor there.
That's a similar response to the questions that we had around mobile traders in the last session. Hey, so there's a really interesting question here about when you leave a lender. So it says, how long after you leave a lender will you be liable for breaches of the duty while you were in your director or senior manager role?
Sure. So the CCCF Act sets out that proceedings for pecuniary penalties for a breach of the due diligence duty can be commenced any time within 3 years after the matter giving rise to the breach. In other words, the relevant conduct was discovered or ought reasonably to have been discovered. So it's not just 3 years from the date of the conduct. It's 3 years from the date that it was discovered or ought to have been discovered. So basically what that means is that liability can attach to a director or senior manager for failings in terms of due diligence for a long time after they step down from the role.
That's a really important thing to remember. There's a question that's come in around documentation and policies and procedures, which looks like one that might apply to lots of people. So the question says, is it necessary to have documented policies and procedures where the lender is one individual operating alone? So we've had a couple of questions about a single individual. So where you've got one person operating alone, is it necessary to have documented policies and procedures?
Yeah, so sort of the one-man band type example. Yeah, so it's an interesting question, really. So I think our position would be that, well, firstly, I should say there's no explicit requirement in the due diligence duty to formally record the lender's policies and procedures, and so it's just one of our recommendations, and we'd acknowledge that it's less likely to be helpful if the business is not intending to grow beyond that one individual, and if that individual is comfortable that the procedures that it has are appropriately designed to meet compliance, so that those are to be compliant. So yeah, so it's less likely to be helpful in that scenario where it's just one individual, provided those things are there. Yeah, so it may not be necessary in that situation. In any case, though, we would encourage taking steps to document what you have done and what the lender is doing to achieve compliance. So that keeping records, documenting what's happening is really important.
So let's take that a step further. What should a director and senior manager be documenting to demonstrate due diligence?
So what it makes sense to document will vary, and it will vary by lender and the nature of the lender, as well as varying between each director and senior manager. So the nature of the lender's systems and the role of the individual in respect of those systems will be relevant factors in determining what it makes sense to record. So what we'd say is that what is important is that you keep records that demonstrates the steps that you have taken to meet your due diligence duty, whether that's by, for example, delegating tasks to other individuals to perform, reviewing and responding to reports about compliance, or whether it may be even undertaking tasks yourself. So just keeping those records.
Yeah, that makes sense. Hey, there's an interesting question that's come through, which is sort of raises some complexity to this. So the question says, what should you do if you are prevented from taking steps to ensure the lender's compliance with its CCCF Act obligations by other directors or senior managers?
Yes, so it is possible that you will get so in the course of fulfilling your responsibilities or attempting to meet your obligations under the due diligence duty, you may get voted down on something. So whether that's formally or informally, it may be that other directors or senior managers prevent you from being able to take further steps. So an example might be failing to pass a board resolution that you think is necessary for further compliance measures, or being directed by a more senior manager not to take further compliance related steps or further steps in relation to a compliance task. So where you see that there is a risk of non-compliance arising from that failure to take action, what we would suggest you do is you identify that risk to the other individuals firstly. So you point that out and you say to them that you see there being a risk of the lender's non-compliance from not taking steps. And if they still disagree with you, we'd say you should keep a formal record of that. So make sure you document that down. And if possible, you get that record verified by the others. So yeah, get that record of those interactions recorded and if possible, verified.
That's good information. Thank you. Hey, so one of the questions we got through after the last sessions was about relying on regular assurance reports. So, and the question said, is reliance on a regular assurance report a way of meeting the duty?
Yeah, so we've gone away and had to think about that. The first point I'd just state about this is that generally you cannot assume or trust an assertion that someone else in the business is taking care of compliance. So that's not enough to make the due diligence duty. More needs to be done. And while you can delegate tasks as part of meeting the duty, you cannot delegate responsibility for the duty to someone else. In terms of the suggestion of a regular assurance report, so that may be one step you can take towards fulfilling the duty. However, whether that report alone is enough and is sufficient for meeting the standard required by the duty will depend on A, the content of the report, and B, the nature of your responsibilities. So if your role is not one in which you are expected to be taking a hands-on role in compliance, you may be able to rely on a report, on a regular assurance report for meeting your duty in certain circumstances. However, you will need to satisfy yourself that the report is comprehensive, that it's prepared appropriately, and that it addresses all relevant matters. So in particular, those things that I've already talked about today, the establishment of systems, requiring staff to follow procedures, undertaking checks of the systems, identifying deficiencies with the systems, and remedying deficiencies with those systems where they're identified. So the final point I would make on that is that where an assurance report would not satisfy a reasonable director or senior manager, it will be incumbent on you to take further steps to ensure that the lender is compliant.
That's great, Alex. Thank you. If we're thinking about compliance, how does that affect certification? So, you know, how does failure to comply with the due diligence duty relate to certification?
So when assessing the probity, reputation, and financial integrity of an individual for the purposes of certification, one of the matters we'll look into is whether that individual has been subject to an investigation by the Commerce Commission or by another regulator that's resulted in enforcement action. But we will also look at whether the individual was a director or a senior manager at a time when conduct occurred that resulted in regulatory action. So what that means to say is, even if we don't investigate your compliance with the due diligence duty, a finding of non-compliance by the lender while you held your position may be a factor in the fit and proper assessment. So relevant to certification will be the surrounding circumstances, the seriousness of the conduct, and your role in that conduct. The final point I'd just make on that is that unlike proceedings for the breach for breaches of the due diligence duty, which would be focused on what steps you have taken in the past, the certification assessment is primarily forward-looking and asks the question of whether you are fit and proper to perform your role, or likely to be fit and proper to perform your role going forward.
Hey, Alex, there's a question here which says, why is there a restriction on indemnifying directors and senior managers for breaches of the due diligence duty? Is that something you can speak to today?
Yes, I can to some extent. So while this is a policy question, and we don't speak for MB, who are responsible for creating the rules, we can provide our understanding of what that rule is there for. So the principle that we see behind enacting a duty of due diligence for directors and senior managers is to incentivize those individuals to take an active and considered role in making sure that the lender is meeting its statutory obligations. So if those lenders, those individuals, if they were able to in effect contract out of that duty by obtaining an indemnity from either the lender or an insurer, that incentive would be significantly diminished.
That's great, thank you. Hayes, there's a question that's come up here regarding smaller or charitable organisations, and we had this question at our last session that we covered in responsible lending as well, so I think it's worth covering now. And they ask, is there any dispensation or exemption available for smaller organisations or those with a charitable purchase? And the example that is used here is those providing, small amounts to purchase, education materials, or the example we had last time was Chromebooks. Is there any dispensation or exemption available for charitable or smaller organisations?
So the short answer to that, Sonia, is no. If the arrangements of the organisation are subject to the CCCF Act, because, for example, their consumer credit contracts or their credit sales entered into by a mobile trader, that organisation will be subject, and its arrangements will be subject to the duties and obligations set out in the CCCF Act, and that includes the duty of due diligence on its directors and senior managers. So there are no exemptions or dispensations set out in the Act based on loan size, organisation size, or loan purpose.
So Alex, I'm conscious that looks like we've got about 10 minutes left, and we've got some more questions to get through. But before we just go to those last sort of 4 or 5 questions, I wonder if you could set out for people some specific practical examples of what a director or senior manager needs to do with regard to due diligence.
Sure. So as I've set out earlier, what will be expected of you will vary with respect to the nature of the lender's business, the role of the individual, and the amount of influence that individual has on areas of the business that are impacted by the CCCF Act. So depending on your role, some example of steps that we recommend taking are understanding the lender's obligations, or at least making efforts to understand the lender's obligations under the CCCF Act, keeping up to date with law changes where they happen, engaging experts to assist with the lender's compliance, and relying on those experts only where it's reasonable to do so. Ensuring that the lender has good record keeping practices, and we'd say implementing audit processes to ensure the lender's policies and procedures are designed to achieve compliance and are doing what they're meant to. So that's probably a helpful point for me to just point out that there are examples of this set out in the appendix to the guidance, which is available on the website. And so they relate to responsible lending and initial disclosure, respectively.
That's great. And I can see that the guidance, the due diligence guidance, has just popped up into the chat. We've got another question here about, and we talked about this a little bit before, where you've got a very small organisation. So the question says, what if there is only one senior staff member, but they generally have no decision-making powers? That power is with the directors. Will the senior staff member still be liable for duty?
So it's always a contextual matter. So it's looking at all the surrounding circumstances to decide whether a person is a director or as a senior manager. So if there are directors and this individual's not part of that group, then they're unlikely to be a director, but they're not taking on a role similar to that of a director. They may still be a senior manager, and so that's where they have significant. The nature of their role means that they're able to exercise significant influence over the management or administration of the business. So it's really asking, can this person exercise influence over the management or administration of the business? And if so, and due to their role they can, and if so, that person is likely subject to the due diligence duty and should be taking steps to ensure that they're complying with that.
No matter what the size of the business. I can see
no
that.
matter what the size of the business.
Yeah, that makes sense. Hey, so there's a question that's come in regarding dealers and intermediaries, so and their responsibilities. So it says, what responsibilities will dealers or brokers have as an intermediary? Will the responsibility remain with the directors and the senior managers?
So the duty of due diligence applies in respect of the directors and senior managers of lenders. So those are the parties to consumer credit contracts, in effect, or credit sales with a mobile trader. So brokers will not have a duty of due diligence simply by virtue of being brokers, but they will need to consider whether they may be lenders, as that term is defined under the CCCF Act.
Great. And I think probably just one last question before we start to wrap up, because we want to give people time to complete the survey so that if they have any other questions, we can get those through. And it's about remediating issues. So, when it comes to remediating issues, is there any guidance as to what makes up a timely manner in different types of circumstances? So when it comes to remediating, is there any guidance that helps lenders understand what a timely manner means in different types of circumstances?
There's no guidance that comes to mind. I think it's probably important to focus more on the lender in that circumstance. So consider what the lender is able to achieve while still meeting its existing obligations and its ongoing obligations to its customers. So in any circumstance, it's just making sure that it's taking its responsibilities to remediate seriously, and it's doing what it can to achieve that in a timely manner. But no, there isn't anywhere I can think of specifically that you can go, but we will look to come up with some guidance on that in the future, if that's something that we can do.
That's fantastic, Alex. Thank you so much. So I'm conscious of everyone's time. We're really grateful that you've been able to spend 45 minutes with us talking through all of the questions that have come up regarding due diligence. And Alex, thank you so much for your expertise. I know it's a lot for our viewers to take in over Zoom, but remember, we are recording it. There are handouts and also the guidance, and the chat, which has some of the summary details, will also be available in the recording. So Alex, thank you so much for your time, your knowledge and your expertise. We're really grateful. Is there anything else you want to add?
No, Sonia, no, I'd just say thank you to all the participants for attending, and I really sincerely hope it's been useful. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Alex. Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for watching and engaging with this webinar. I hope it's given you a deeper understanding of the law changes around due diligence. Just like last time, and as I've mentioned before, we are running a survey where you can let us know what we've missed or what areas you need more details around. So at the end of the session, when you close the window, you'll be redirected to an anonymous survey. Pop your questions in here and also let us know what you thought of the survey, the seminar. It helps us to improve. So when the window comes up, click continue to go through to the survey. If you have any questions, or if you've got anything that you'd like to know about this session or any of the other sessions we're running, you can email us at credit.advocacy@comcom.govt.nz. And remember, we are recording this session and we'll email it out to everyone. So we have one more session today, that's disclosure, led by Crystal Uden at 3:30. And then tomorrow we have two in-depth webinars, one on advertising and fees at 10:30 in the morning, and then one on certification at 11:30. So, kia ora koutou for your great listening skills. I'll close as we started with karakia. Uruhia, uruhia, uruhia ki te uru tapanui. Kia wātia, kia mama, te nākau, te tiana te wairoa e te ara tangata. Koe ara e rongo, whakaere ake ke runga. Kia tina, tina huie, tai kie. Thanks everyone. Haere rā.